All right. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to ARTNeT Webinar on trade wins and misses of 2022 and the look ahead. My name is Mia Mikic, and I'm here in the capacity of ARTNeT advisor at large and also as a moderator of this session. The session is recorded, and so we will be disseminating it on our website. And so by staying in the session, you're actually agreeing to be recorded if you actually take the floor and be seen on camera as well. So let me first start with some housekeeping rules, as it is still the normal in Zoom era. This webinar is actually in the meeting setup, so we are asking kindly all the participants to turn their mics off and to turn their cameras off. And to use the chat function to raise the questions they may have. And you can pose the questions as we go through the session. And we will, if you actually also nominate the person whom you want to ask the question, that would make my job easier. We'll try to go through as many questions as possible. If we don't, and if you are really keen to get an answer, you can actually email the question through my email to the speaker. I will pass it on. And I hope we will get Santa send you an early Christmas present with the answer to your question. So with me today are three very special guests. We have posted their not full CVs, but bio sketches on the webinar web page, and so please peruse those and read in detail about their wonderful achievements in the past and present. And here I will just, to save the time, just give the necessary few details of their current engagements. So we have Ms. Cecilia Malmström, a former member of the European Commission and the European Parliament, commissioner, a current non-resident senior fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and the host of the wonderfully topical and informative Trade Wins virtual discussion series. And very importantly, Cecilia is on the advisory board of Trade Experts. And if you don't know what Trade Experts is, you're missing out. And you please go and Google it and find it and become a member. So then we have with us Ambassador Ms. Pimchanok von Korpon Pitfield. Sorry. Ambassador, whom everyone in trade community actually know as Nan, so I might actually switch to her nickname for the ease of pronunciation as well. As I said, she is ambassador and permanent representative of Thailand to the WTO and the WIPO. And dare I say, from the corridors, I know that she is one of the hardest working ambassadors there. Prior to that post, she was Director General of Trade Policy and Strategy Office at the Ministry of Commerce of Thailand. And I also know from experience of some other people that she is a very tough negotiator, or known as a tough negotiator. And so lastly, let me introduce Professor Robert Scholar. Robert was a director of the New Zealand APEC Study Center at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, until very recently, and he actually established the center. It was one of the first in the APEC sort of community, and was guiding it all throughout to very successful work and operation. And so he's also a professor at the Auckland University Economics Department, now carries the title of a honorary academic at that department. He's very well known advisor to governments and international organizations regionally and globally, and has authored many publications. So we have three speakers that have practical, hands-on and theoretical background in area of trade and trade policy making. And I think we couldn't have scored better in terms of having people to ask tough questions. And so I myself have many questions, but we have limited the area really by the title of the session, and we'll be focusing on the spectrum of the features of trade policies in terms of good, bad, and ugly, I can say. So let me just start it off by saying that I think 3 days ago or 2 days ago, the WTO has released a new report on trade monitoring and trade policy monitoring. And in the launch of this report, the Dr. Ngozi, the DG of the WTO, has really raised concerns with continuing rise in restrictive and discriminatory policies, in particular in area of export and in particular of area of food. It's called 3F, food, feed, and fertilizers, which have really then spillover effects, including into the poverty and inflation, etc. So this is one concern that we have recorded in the report, but of course there are so many more concerns that have been put to the table, to the agenda, and into practices of traders and producers since not only start of the pandemic, but over a longer period of time as well, prior to the pandemic with the trade war, etc. And there were so many different shocks, not only through the tariff wars and pandemic and conflicts and actual war, but also the ones that related to the change in the positions or the mindsets of the major trading partners' policy making. So this creates very noisy, very complicated environment to understand how trade can be then continuously or still used as the engine of not only growth, but of sustainable development. And through this, maybe we will be able to identify these qualities of trade policy that we can still use towards that goal, and also identify the obstacles and see how we can handle those. So let me start the first question. I'm going to pose first three questions of same to each speaker, but I hope that they will be able to differentiate the answers, not only in terms of their experience, but also the region they are coming from, and they can speak about in more details. And so the first question would be really to look at this, as I said, good sides of or successes that we can identify over last year in 2022 for trade policy. And I'll start with Cecilia, and then go to Nan and Robert. So Cecilia, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mia. I'm honored to be in this panel with Robert and Nan, if I may. It is actually hard to be a bit optimistic this year. It's been a tough year in many, many regards, but at least for a kickoff, let's start. I'm joining you from a snowy morning in western Sweden. So it's still dark here, but I think it will get brighter. Maybe this is symbolic as well. Well, I think the first thing to at least to note and to be happy about is that despite the pandemic, despite the war, that we are all seeing the consequences, notably, of course, the Ukrainian people, that trade is still working. There has been hiccups during the pandemic. There's been logistical problems. Of course, factories and ports have been closed. There's been a lack of certain commodities and certain key materials, but overall trade has been working. And I think that is also confirmed by the WTO and other reports. And we should note that even if the world has been in the most difficult circumstances, trade is working. And where it's not working, that's where we should look at how to do targeted action and not running to totally overrunning policies that has been working in the past. So that is a good thing, and we should build upon that. The second thing, looking purely from a European perspective, the European Union has, during these last 2-3 years, not moved so much in the trade era. There has been trade agreements waiting to be ratified, and there has been, pause in an engagement. Maybe this is changing now. I'm very happy, and especially in this occasion, to see that just a few months ago, the trade agreement between the European Union and New Zealand was concluded. I was privileged to launch that some years ago, so I was very happy to see the conclusion and how well it has been received by an audience that sometimes is critical to trade and elements. But for instance, in the European Parliament, it has been very warmly welcomed because of its complexity and its focus on fair trade and sustainability elements, together with the classical elements that you can find in the trade agreement. It is now in legal scrubbing, as we call it, to check that all the legalities are there, and it has to be translated to all the languages of the European Union. But it seems that all that will be ready in our spring, meaning in a couple of months, and hopefully that can then enter into force. And we have also seen work resuming with your neighbor and another friend, Australia, that had been on pause for a while, but now they are sort of speeding up the negotiations. And I heard only this week that they hope that by mid next year it could be finalized, and that is also a very good thing. And I can also note that the European Union has resumed negotiations with India. These have been going on for a long time and then been paused and so on for different reasons. But now at least there is an attempt from both sides to sit together and see where are we, what can we do, how can we move forward? And that, of course, would be of enormous importance if we could have an agreement between the European Union and India. And the third thing, and I'll stop and then I can come back to the more gloomy side, but let's start with this, is that after all, even if it's not revolutionary, there was progress in Geneva in June with WTO. I think all of us here, not knowing the audience, but at least us in the panel, are devoted friends of the multilateral system. And it has been painful to see how it's not really living up to the needs that the world has today. But overall, and despite all gloomy predictions, there was a meeting in Geneva, there were some progress, there was agreement on fisheries, on waiver, and maybe the most important of all, that there was a joint feeling that we must look at reforms on a long-term perspective. So commitment for the next ministerial to start working on a reform agenda. And this showed, and this is very much thanks to, of course, efforts by all the member states, but also by the dynamic leadership of Dr. Ngozi, who was really pushing to show that the NGO is still alive and kicking. Yes, there are problems, but there is still life in the organization, and there is a global willingness to move forward. And I think this is something we need to build upon, and that leaves at least some good hope for the years to come. And I'll stop there, Mia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia, and I think your sort of trio of successes are well chosen, filling the glass rather full, and being optimistic. I think the biggest optimism point, probably from the global perspective and from the developing countries' point of view, is this last point that you made, that WTO has shown signs of life and that is able to actually pull through difficult negotiation processes. And also, I think everyone has realized that without trade, the fight against COVID would have been much less effective, and we would be in much tougher situation now if we didn't have some of the base rules and of course trade flows. Let me move on to Ambassador Nan. I hope you can continue with this optimism, and you are coming, of course, from Geneva. But we would like you to also reflect on the Southeast Asia and Thailand in particular.
Yes, thank you very much, Mia, Dr. Mia, and I'm very honored to be part of this distinguished panels, and I think we don't have much time, so I will just go straight forward. And you know what? Two of my points have already been spoken by Madam Commissioner Cecilia. So, well, this is not this is of course a coincidence, because my first trade wins of 2022 is maybe I'm going to say slightly different, but I think the essence is like what Cecilia has just said. First is that I feel that for 2022, one of the winner of trade policy is trade itself, because during this past year, especially in Asia, because I'm speaking from my perspective of Asian developing country, we have seen that keeping trade ongoing and as open as possible is very conducive to recovery after so many things that has been happening, you know, from COVID to the war and the conflict and everything. Our region in Asia, we have seen that by trying to engage and keep the supply chain ongoing, keep trade as open as possible, trade has been instrumental in making our recovery easier and faster than many other regions in the world. And I think this confidence in trade also extend to when we, from my view, you know, Kumia, when you look at COVID and food insecurity issues and all those things that have been hitting us, we have recognized how important trade is, and it will become, it is already a very important tool to combat all these seemingly non-trade issues. That's my view, that and we have seen in this past year that trade is instrumental in helping us going through problems. So I hope that country will try to keep the trade regime as open and resorting to as fewer restrictions as possible. That's my view for the first point, that the winning is that trade has re-emphasized how important it is for us, and we have to do continue. My second win is also on the Geneva package of MC12. Of course, everybody knows that it was not perfect, but maybe I want to highlight one thing that I found as my experience in engaging in those negotiations is that first, you can see from the conclusion of the fishery agreement how important the sustainability issue has become in trade, and also has been, I wouldn't say 100% agreed on, but at least everybody shared the feeling that this is the way that we have to continue, you know. The question is not how to, the question is how to reconcile trade advancement, trade development with sustainability. I think that is one thing that has been permeated, and countries from large to small, developing countries, everybody knew the impact of climate change on us. We knew we had to do something. That is one thing, and that came out of the MC. Of course, there are other things too, like the food issue was also very debated a lot. But okay, we could come up with only the decisions. But I hope the work will continue this year and past next year before the MC13. But of course, there were failures, in my view, that the inability to come up with something concrete on agriculture was to great disappointment to several countries of Asia whose population engaged quite a lot in agriculture sector. But nevertheless, I agree with Cecilia that the feeling that actually we could do it if we want to was very much recognized. Last point, then this may be only specific to my region, is that I would say, like Cecilia gave the EU New Zealand FTA. In Asia, I think the great achievement of 2022 is the ASEP, the regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Okay, I admit that some negotiators or some developed countries think that RCEP is not ambitious enough. But you know what, Kumia, you are very familiar with Asia. Asia trades concentrate a lot on manufactured goods. So RCEP was just what we wanted and what we needed. And this, it may not be as ambitious on sustainability or social dimension, or maybe we can even do more on digital aspect. But RCEP is the answer for Asia right now, because it helps us to keep the supply chain, the global, the regional supply chain together. It enables SME in a region to get into the wagon of trade liberalization, and it reduces the spaghetti bowl effect in the region. And I'm sure that it will be very useful for investors in the region as well. So I would say, from my perspective, these are the thing that did great for Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunan. And as you know, we have been fighting for a long time to have a simplified rules of origin across ASEAN countries, and so RCEP is finally bringing that to bear, and you know, that is a really great success. And actually, some of my sub questions were to see whether there is any commonalities between the speakers, and so I'm really happy that that already I have got like a core common wins, which is good. Let me give floor to Robert for his take.
Thanks very much, Mia, and it's certainly my privilege to be invited to be on this symposium with such a distinguished pair of co-panelists. So I'll try to not to justify an imposter syndrome in what I say. First of all, from my country's point of view, New Zealand, absolutely agree with Cecilia. Of course, for New Zealand, as a very small country, the FTA with the European Union is a much bigger deal than it is for the European Union. And it was actually one of two FTAs that New Zealand concluded this year, the other one being with, of course, the United Kingdom. And also there were upgrades to two agreements that were concluded in the case of the New Zealand-China agreement, and also reached a substantially agreement that they were substantially concluded in the case of the agreement with the Southeast Asian members of ASEAN. So those were big deals. I suppose if one was to be a little bit not so positive, you would say that the fact that these were such important deals for New Zealand, they mean that New Zealand has its trade covered by free trade agreements with all of its major trading partners except the United States. And these agreements cover something like 3/4 of New Zealand's trade. The fact that this is really so important is perhaps also a reflection of as a reaction to the growing uncertainty over the future of the multilateral trading system, when support for the multilateral trading system has always been at the bedrock of New Zealand trade policy. So the fact that we perhaps don't feel ourselves able to be quite so confident in relying on that is perhaps in the background there. As Cecilia said, the EU-New Zealand FTA does have strong provisions on sustainability and climate change. I think essentially it's the first agreement in which the EU has secured the inclusion of its preferred treatment of climate change issues. And from New Zealand's point of view, that's a very good thing. There's the fulfillment of commitments under the Paris Agreement are subject to dispute settlement. And if the EU decides to hold New Zealand's feet to the fire over that issue, that will be very much to the good, I think. So that's very positive. And a particular innovation that's important to New Zealand, but maybe doesn't register so much in the EU, but very important for us, is the inclusion of provisions to ensure collaboration on making the agreement work well for the economic interests of our indigenous population, that is the Maori people. And that's a first for New Zealand, and again, a very important breakthrough for us. I do think there are some things that can be said. I might leave this to talking about the misses when we start talking about agriculture. I think there are some misses that we could register there. Not from New Zealand's point of view. New Zealand did very well out of the agreement, but there are some wider implications. And I did very well on agriculture, but there are some wider implications for the trading system, and in fact, also for the EU, which perhaps need to be registered as reservations on that deal. Going to the Asia Pacific region, where we sit, absolutely, from the point of view of the region, one of the biggest wins for the region was the entry into force of the RCEP, which has been covered by Ambassador Nan. It's important not only because it's a big agreement covering a large part of the world economy, a significant part of the world economy in a very important region of the world, but also because it over time will create a single set of rules for those 15 member economies, which, although it has been criticised for perhaps a limited ambition, the achievement of a single set of rules for such an important group of trading economies, I think, is a really big achievement. It will take time to implement. The implementation program schedule is quite cautious, but over time this is going to make a big difference, I think, to economic integration among the countries of the region, and also the supply chains that crisscross the regions. Both those things are, despite the intensive efforts that are being made in some quarters of the world to pull those relationships apart. So the RCEP, I think, is a real bedrock agreement for the Asia Pacific region, and also to the extent that it can be seen as supporting the multilateral rules. The fact that we have a single set of rules agreed by these 15 economies in this very important region can be seen as potentially very supportive of the multilateral trading system. So I think the RCEP is really a big win. Finally, I'll just mention APEC. Two things in the APEC outcome that I think could deserve to be highlighted. The first one is the fact that climate change and sustainability has come to the head of the APEC agenda. And that's due in no small measure, in fact, to Thailand's hosting of the APEC year this year, insisting that the leaders sign on to a declaration on the biocircular and green economy. Also, the flagship APEC economic policy report highlights the role for structural reform and the green economy to play a leading part in the recovery of the region. So the fact that these issues have come to the top of the APEC agenda, I think, is very important. Of course, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, as we say in English, but it will generate a work program over the coming years within APEC that will be more or less obliged to address the many difficult issues that are raised by these issues. And I think APEC's voluntary non-binding modality is ideal for the phase of the discussion that we are now entering into, where we will be discussing, consulting, exchanging experiences, analyses to try and reach a consensus on ways forward on these very important issues. So I think that's a really important development. The other thing that also I think due to Thailand was the insistence that the free trade area of the Asia Pacific should remain on the APEC agenda, not because we think in the region that a negotiated agreement on free trade in the Asia Pacific is anywhere near being a possibility, but because what that agenda does is to keep fully on the APEC agenda the ambition of the region, which has always been there from the beginning, to establish free trade and investment across the region. And that it reflects, I think, the determination of most APEC members to keep that ambition very firmly in view as something that we do still aspire to over the long term, despite the various serious difficulties that are created for the region by some developments in the region. So I think that's really a message being sent across to the parts of the region that perhaps are not behaving in ways conducive to realising that ambition, that most of the APEC members actually want it to happen, even if it won't happen immediately. And I think that that Thailand's effort in keeping that agenda to the forefront, I think, was a very important thing for them to have done. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob, and I think thank you both Nan and Rob for bringing in this, as Nan put it, reconciliation between trade proper, if you wish, in sustainability, and for really making clear that I think the mindset is shifting globally now, and that we when we talk about trade, we actually talk about sustainable trade, and we want for that trade to have no direct sort of harmful consequences towards climate and other environmental issues. So I think that's one of the elements that is a clear winner maybe out of 22, but it also shows, Rob, as you were saying, if APEC economies that include, of course, US and China could agreed on a declaration that actually posits such a direction, then it is a welcome sign that perhaps globally we can achieve results as well in that one. Okay, I think we have gotten quite a nice sort of set of very good things that happened. Let us now turn to less nice things, and let me start again with Cecilia. So what from your point of view or European point of view, what are the failures or things that we could have actually achieved and did not, and what are the consequences of such failures?
Well, thank you, Mia. After kicking off with optimism, we again go back to the more gloomy side of this. And I heard that the Collins English Dictionary actually appointed the word perma-crisis as the word of the year, which illustrates a little bit the situation where we are. Of course, in Europe, we are very much affected both by the effect still of COVID, which will take generations to overcome, actually, but also, of course, by the war in our vicinity. A brutal war against an innocent country was unprovokedly invaded, and we see that the most horrendous war crimes are being committed, and the winter is long and cold. So, and this is, of course, a humanitarian suffering and a sort of threat to the security order, but it also has consequences on trade, of course, with the huge amount of sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, and also the dependencies that are now emerging. So I would say my first point is the sort of geopolitization of trade, or the securitization of trade, that companies now has to see, where can I buy my goods and services? Yes, but where are the risks? Are there war? Are there sanctions? Will I get those delivered? And this is a kind of thinking that it's not unique, but it is really, being systematic in a way, and that is affecting all of us. We see the energy dependency, we see the inflation, the high prices, the shortages, as you mentioned in the beginning, of food, feed, and fertilizers, but also some other things. And this is together with COVID, of course, which also made many companies realize that dependence is something you need to prepare for. You have to become much more flexible and diverse and resilient. And that is not a bad thing in itself, but it leads to more politicization, especially in Europe. But I think my co-panelists will agree, we are in a huge dependency of energy from Russia, but also rare earth metals, which is the new oil, so to say. There will be a huge dependence, and the production and mining and processing of this will have to increase with 500% just the coming years if we are to this is so important for the green transition, because all the wind turbines and the electric vehicles and so on are in great need of lithium, of platina, of nickel, of cobalt, and all these things, and they are very much processed in China. And this this dependence, of course, is making companies wary, which leads me to my second point, which is fits into this, which is this notion that will affect trade, and mostly in a negative way, in my opinion. That we hear now about homeshoring or reshoring or deshoring or friendshoring, even the new words that come into the dictionary, which make the notion that trade and the whole supply chains need to move closer to home. And to a certain extent, this is, you know, natural. We in Europe have started to look, how do we have supplies to prepare for a second pandemic or a new pandemic when it comes to medical supplies, where there was a big shortage in the beginning. So that is being addressed. But also, how can we reduce our dependence vis-a-vis China? And that's not something you do overnight. You know, open a new mine is not a weekend thing. So this is a discussion to see where are these metals in other countries, and where can you start cooperating with these. And that, of course, I mean, Australia is a candidate, Chile, there are others. Also in my country, up in the north, we have a lot of these metals, but they are down under. And, you know, there are licenses, there are permissions, there are environmental concerns. We have indigenous people there as well, the Sami population. So this is not, it's easy to say, but it's really hard to do. And this sort of friend-shoring of supply chains will be a big problem in the future, I think, because also who is a friend? And who is not a friend, and who comes between? So this leads to a protectionism in the world globally. We see it in the US, we see it in Europe, we see it elsewhere as well. And combined with a massive wave of subsidies, which we also see in China, for instance, in core technology, this is harming trade if it goes on to out of control. And the third problem linked to this, I'm taking it all in the same, is of course that despite the progress the WTO made, the global institutions are still very weak. So there is no arena to control this, or to discipline, or to force us all to be disciplined in the interest of global trade functioning. I think this has also been discussed, but Nan, you will confirm this in Geneva, of course, that WTO doesn't have the teeth to force the world to become disciplined on this. And this, of course, weakens even more the trust to the multilateral system. So all this, the securitization, the friend-shoring, the subsidy wave, and the lack of global governance is something that will definitely affect trade patterns in the future, and in most of it in a negative way, I fear. Sorry to be so gloomy, but that was the question.
No, I wanted you know, I really wanted to have this actually maybe more belonging to ugly rather than bad, but anyway, thank you very much for really dumping onto us all these issues with the supply chain reshaping in different directions, because I think many of these things are convoluted, and it's okay if we are talking about the rationale of redesign of supply chain for really making sure the supply is there for essential goods, like in medical and you know, equipment and vaccine, etc. But it's another thing if as you mentioned, it's a securitization for a different reason, and just to try to be discriminatory against the source of certain goods. So balancing act there and trying to find the, you know, how can we meet the economic rationale combined with long-term sort of economic strategy or strategic industrial policy on the economic ground, vis-a-vis those that are just sort of based on other reasons, more political, but not necessarily justified completely. So I'm sure that Kun Nen will add to this gloomy picture as well, even with a smile.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm afraid that I will have to add maybe another dimension to the gloomy picture. Yes, I have similar views to Cecilia, but maybe from a trade negotiator perspective, I would go for something more specific on trade. Because the first thing that I think we missed in 2022 is that we have seen and we have let protectionism go on and on and on unchecked. I think that was my first worries. We have seen you know, the problem since the trade war in President Trump's term in the US with China, and now everything we have seen conflicts and everywhere, but I want to highlight in terms of trade only that in Geneva we have seen many reports of trade measures being used for protectionist reasons, and also you know, let alone the national the securitization of trade, as Cecilia called them. This is the thing that I don't think we should leave it unchecked. But of course, in this age and time, like we all agree that trade is important tool for countries to address their economic recovery and development. We also have to acknowledge that there are members can do what they think is required, you know. Okay, so in the sense of we don't want to see too many protectionist measures, but again, it's difficult to tell members or to tell countries, hey, you cannot do this and do that at all time, because to a certain extent they have the flexibility. But this kind of thing is going on too much. We can see in trade, in goods, for example, there are lots of measures being there. So my first thing to highlight failure is that we are seeing a lot of rising protectionism, and it's going on unchecked for the moment. Second thing that I want to say is probably it's not so gloomy, but there was a slowness in multilateral engagement to catch up or address the multilateral issues. I think we are too slow to do things. The pandemic, the COVID was a good example. Even though we got the waiver, but it came, you know, I wouldn't say it's too little, too late, but it's almost felt like that, you know. So something breaks down in multilateral setting, how to address multilateral problem. And I don't want this to continue when we are taking up issues like climate change. Robert has already talked about APEC, which I was planning to do so at the end of my question, my session. But of course, my view is that maybe we need to start addressing multilateral problems such as climate change, the food security issue, and also some others development related. Maybe in not only plurilateral, which we are doing at the WTO, but also in regional, you know, regional engagement. Maybe if we have critical mass or critical interest enough, like we had seen in APEC, that okay, climate change or environment now must feature as part of economic development. But to get a solution at the multilateral setting like in WTO here, it would take time. So maybe we need building blocks somewhere. That's my personal view. And I hope that the Asia Pacific, the EU, or in other region, when we take up an issue of environment and climate, then we would have something. And I also think multilateral organizations need to work together closer than before. You know, we had WIPO, WTO, WHO work together on COVID. And so in the future, I hope to see that some of these multilateral bodies will work together on climate issues, and even on, let's say, digital economy development, digital trade, which is another emerging issues. My last one is probably not the trade's fault, but I'm just saying that there's because of the conflict and stuff, I have seen so much eroding trust among countries. And I don't want to elaborate too much. I think everybody knows. I think this is the elephant in the room. But sometimes you need to get together and solve difficult questions. First, you must have some trust. I know this is easier said than done, Kun Mia. But if we are not sure how the engagement would continue, there must be somewhere that we can rebuilding or regenerating trust in the trade engagement. I would say that, and we saw in APEC that if countries or members of any organization are keen, then they can agree on something. In WTO recently, we have agreed on the work program for food insecurity, which I think is a good sign. But of course, food is an issue that is affecting every country in the world right now. And so I think it's easy to get agreement on that. But let's say a broader issue like trade conflict or climate, I hope that trust will build itself because otherwise we cannot continue with the multilateral talks. So that's my not so gloomy. Eh?
No, well, so. But thank you very much for bringing trust into the discussion, because this is a big, I used to work for UN, and I think the sort of weakening of trust among the members that we were working with also showed in terms of the strength of what organization can achieve. And on the other side, we were always very rationally looking into that and saying, well, global commons or concerns cannot be actually resolved without everyone's working together. And everyone will have to realize and therefore will have to collaborate, whether they trust or not trust, because they are led by this one common goal. But it seems that people are starting to believe that they can actually separate out and build the walls and not be affected by these same global issues and try to sort of build the gaps in terms of collaboration and cooperation. But that's a big worry, and I think that will remain so. And I think one of my big worries for future is how to actually bridge the gap. And I think what you suggested, Kunnen, is that if we do it again, because we have done it before, but if we do it again by promoting trust and confidence in each other from the regional level up, then perhaps we can achieve more. I have another word for you, Cecilia. It is not only that the permacrisis that you said, but another one is the middle out and bottom up developments. And so I think with trust again between the countries, we'll have to look at those middle level countries that can play very significant role, like New Zealand, like Thailand, that can work with other sides as well. Rob, let me go to you for your share of pessimism.
Okay, all right. Well, I have to say that I share all the depression that my co-panelists have expressed over some of the developments in the global trading system. And Ambassador Nan talked about an elephant in the room. And for me, when I look at this, and I look at it from the perspective of the Asia-Pacific region, looking at what I think is the biggest miss, and it's one that's occurred in 2022 and goes back into 2021, and that is the fact that the Biden administration has not, as so many of us hoped they would, rolled back the protectionist trade policies of the Trump administration, but has actually in many ways doubled down on them. And I think that is really a huge miss. Of course, because the United States is such an important economy in the world, country in the world trade, that when we see this behavior from the United States, it makes it quite difficult for other countries, especially smaller countries, to know how to respond. And we also see we talked about the indiscriminate use of the national security exception to justify any and all trade barriers that might be introduced for various reasons. Securitization, but I think it goes beyond that. It's also the weaponization of trade policy, which, again, although the United States is by far not the only culprit, we saw Japan and Korea engaging in some fairly heavy exchange of weaponry in the trade policy some years ago. But I think the United States, has undeniably been at the forefront of the weaponization of trade policy. And the difficult thing for the rest of the world is that by now, much of this behavior has become normalized in the United States trade policy, and increasingly we're seeing it becoming normalized in the trade policy elsewhere in the world. And I personally, one of the reasons I'm very happy about the New Zealand agreement with the European Union is that we look to the European Union as to one of the most loyal defenders, if you like, of a rules-based trading system among the larger economies anyway, that the European Union stands out to us as a country that really does insist on the importance of international trade rules. And we would hope that the European Union will play a leadership role in guiding us to how we can actually get back to that kind of approach to trade. So, yeah, I do think that the policies of the Biden administration have been a huge disappointment in terms of not reversing the policies of the Trump administration. Of course, when we talk about weaponization of trade, the horrific attack by Russia on Ukraine, of course, raises the question about the justified use of sanctions. And that sort of complicates the issue of weaponizing trade policy, although many countries in the world, of course, have refused to go along with the sanctions. And if we go back to the case of the sanctions against Iran, they were justified under various pretenses, but once the Iranian government was shown to be complying with the JCPOA, the real justification for those sanctions against Iran really disappeared, and yet they still continue to be applied. So I think that's difficult for trade policy. How we as a community deal with that. And one of the hopeful things I do think is occurring is that in some aspects of this weaponization of trade policy, particularly in relation to the US-China conflict, we are seeing resistance from many developing countries, especially in the East Asian region, also in other parts of the world, countries who basically say we do not want to be forced to take sides between the United States and China. We want to maintain our relationships, trade relationships and economic relationships with both these countries because they're both important to us. And so we've certainly seen that in East Asia. I think we've seen it in Latin America, and we've seen it in other parts of the world as well. And that kind of resistance to these developments, I think, if it can be expressed in more positive developments, and I think the RCEP in East Asia is one of those positive developments, and maybe some of the things happening in APEC are also quite positive. If we can get back to a situation where a large majority of the world's trading countries insist that they don't want to go along this path of normalizing all these behaviors, we may be able to get some progress. It's also true, of course, though, that the rise of protectionism that Ambassador Nan talked about is not exclusively attributable to the United States. Simon Evenett and his Global Trade Alert have documented that this actually goes back to at least the global financial crisis. And this, he calls it creeping protectionism, I think. And we've seen this gradual increase of protectionism all around the world, which is now documented in his latest fact book, which really is almost pervasive. And I think I agree with both co-panelists that there has to be some coming together of the international trading systems to say we have to stop this and find ways of, if possible, reversing it. And that's not going to be easy to do. I also did want to just say something. I don't want to be too negative, but in terms of MC12, the latest ministerial, I mean, I completely agree that that was a huge relief that ministerial achieved enough for us to retain faith and perhaps in the case of many countries, a commitment to getting the WTO back to fulfilling its important roles of trade negotiation, transparency, and dispute settlement. But there were some big disappointments too, and Ambassador Nan mentioned it. One of them, that's the failure to make any progress at all on agriculture. Now, I mean, I mentioned that New Zealand did very well on agriculture in its free trade agreement with the European Union, but behind that is that New Zealand is in a way benefiting from the protectionism that the EU practices against our competitors. We're sort of getting a benefit at our competitors' expense and also at the expense of European consumers. But I think more deeply, I sense that developing countries are reaching the stage where they are no longer prepared to just take the outcomes of international trade negotiations that are handed to them by the main players in the system, as has tended to happen in the past. And they are probably, I mean, if the WTO is going to be restored to its proper functioning, there will have to be full buy-in from across the developing world. And I suspect that the developing world is going to say, well, if you want that buy-in, you're going to really have to come up with some progress on areas that are on issues that are really important to us. And agriculture is certainly one of those issues, which, and the main offending parties, of course, are major developing countries, the United States, Japan, unfortunately the European Union, and other developed countries, which I think that has to be addressed if we're going to get the buy-in from developing countries that we will need to restore the WTO to its full vitality. And even on fisheries subsidies, which was highlighted as one of the sort of successes of MC12, if you spoke to our Pacific Island neighbours, New Zealand's Pacific Island neighbours, you would get a very different readout on that outcome, because what that outcome did was to put aside the parts of the previously tabled text which disciplined the most important fisheries subsidies of the distant water fishing nations for the fishing interests of the Pacific Islands and other developing countries that manage fishery resources. Those subsidies were left out for the sake of getting an agreement, and the compromise was to say, well, we'll work towards completing an agreement that includes disciplines on those subsidies within 4 years. But if that agreement is not reached, then that whole agreement lapses. And that's, from the point of view of countries like the Pacific Island nations, that's a huge disappointment. And again, these are developing countries that had big hopes from the WTO, and those hopes were largely not realised, unfortunately. So I think the WTO and the major developed countries in the WTO are going to have to pay much more attention to the interests of the developing countries if we're going to get the WTO back on track.
I hear you, Rob, fully. Let me just add one thing, because you were sort of talking about weaponization, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, of trade. And I think, you know, there are more parties than one to be associated with using that tactic. And we know that Europe is now sort of bringing in the instrument against the coercion use of trade policies that was, I think, first intended to be used against US, but now, of course, it's already in use against China, and in the case with Lithuania. So I think there are different ways in which countries use trade policy as the instrument of foreign policy or a sort of pressure for country to make country to align with non-trade objectives, if you wish, right? And so that is definitely a worry, because we don't want for trade policy to replace diplomacy, cooperation agreements in that context. May I just alert you to, because all of you mentioned in one way or the other that the WTO perhaps is still weak in terms of having teeth to discipline countries to behave according to the rules. And, maybe the rules are too weak or not specific, like in national security, or no country actually wants to get involved in some of other rules to pursue the discipline-seeking behavior, etc. There was a recent paper, I think, Cecilia, by your colleague from Peterson Institute, Douglas Irwin, who compared the strength of disciplining countries in terms of trade policy and success of, keeping stable open trade policies. And so he was comparing IMF, World Bank, and WTO. And the surprising result that he came up with, and of course he inserts various caveats in terms of the research methodology, was that IMF was actually the one institution that succeeded the most, because that they had the instruments in which they could hold countries actually on track with keeping sort of balanced exchange rate and other policies that were associated with also open trade or open borders, etc. So that's a surprising result. It was surprising to me, but I still believe that WTO may develop a sort of fitness in that context, and I think lots of, we don't need a policeman if everyone is agreeable to follow the rules, and therefore we need to just find find a way to which a country can believe that the objective is actually to be achieved by following the rules rather than going around it. All right, so we are fast approaching actually our, we only have like 11 minutes left, but I want to ask you to look ahead, because you see, there are 23 days left before we enter 2023, a new year. And so I would, in that context, what is your big ticket development that you would see happening, or you would like to see happening? But I would like it to be more realistic rather than just hopeful in this forward-looking assessment. So if I may have just a very short answers on that. Thank you. Cecilia, why don't I start again with you?
Optimism is a duty, as Karl Popper said. So let's see. Well, I hope that the European Union next year will ratify the agreement with New Zealand. I also hope it will ratify the done deal with Mexico, Chile, and Mercosur. They are there, they are ready. Mercosur needs some clarification on Amazons, but I think the new president of Brazil can do this. I was also hoping, and I don't know how realistic it is, that the EU would more engage with your region, the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, or how you want to define it, because I think that is where the dynamism in the world is. A wish is that the European Union would join CPTPP. I don't think that will happen immediately, but at least start engaging, because I think that would be very important if those relations could develop in that structure. And I hope that the EU would refrain from too much protectionism. I would see it very dangerously if the EU embarks on a Buy European as an answer to the Buy American. This is going to lead to a chicken race, which will benefit nobody. So these are my three sort of hopes, and some of them more realistic than others.
Kunna?
Yeah, if I may be like a Santa, like you asked me, okay, the one that the unrealistic hope is that I hope that the elephant will leave the room, but I think that may not happen quickly. So I would not elaborate on that. But okay, let's say my realistic expectation, and also I saw a question from the audience asking about how we see climate and environment issue unfolding in the next year. My hope is that the WTO, as one of the multilateral international organizations who has important role to play, will take up all these emerging issues in earnest and proceed in a way that with a positive mindset, like we have the glass half full rather than glass half empty, you know, building on what we have and try to make it agreeable rather than to spend too much time on what we don't have and have to get over it. So my hope is that we would take up these climate issues, environment, food, WTO reform, which is very important for many developed countries. But from developed countries' perspective, WTO reform is not only the dispute settlement, but we must address or at least talk about development dimension of trade policy as well. I think that is my hope that we would be able to at least come up with some common understanding how to address these important issues. And of course, there's digital trade development, you know, that kind of stuff. These are the emerging issues that I hope the WTO will be modernized and able to discuss these new issues rather than staying in the traditional ones and get stuck and not moving forward. Yeah. So I hope that we can have the trust and the stamina and the positive outlook to continue. Yeah.
Thank you, Nan. Robert, what is your big ticket expectation for next year?
Okay, well, I agree with Nan that the elephant isn't going to leave the room, so we'll leave out that possibility. I think I would probably support the wishes of both my co-panelists, and just think trying to just perhaps elaborate on that. I would perhaps hope that the resistance that I talked about among some of the Asia Pacific countries, the developing countries in the Asia Pacific, and developing countries elsewhere, to being drawn into the conflict that's going on between the United States and China in particular, might actually have some kind of positive spin-off, in the sense that it may bring home to China and the United States that actually developing countries don't want this. They want a positive, constructive trading relationship with all their trading partners, including both United States and China, but also including the EU and, of course, other smaller countries as well, and that might actually generate some kind of change in the way that the big powers, particularly the United States and China, approach these issues, and that might follow through in the WTO in particular. I would like to see the WTO address agriculture in some meaningful way, but I think Ambassador Nan was perhaps obliquely suggesting that that's not going to happen, and that's one of those sort of dreams that we might have to put away. But I don't think we can go on forever and just ignoring that issue if we want a truly effective world trading organization that brings together all the countries of the world. And I mean, I do see some hope in the European Union. I hope I'm not being over-optimistic there, but I do see that in the position that the European Union takes in some of these issues, we see perhaps a more positive outlook for these issues than we see from perhaps the other two major players. And I do remember Pascal Lamy saying at a meeting I was at that support for multilateralism is in the DNA of the European Union, that it is so deeply embedded. And perhaps that some of that can somehow, through the intervention of the European Union in various forums, perhaps that some of that can rub off on the other major powers as well.
Thank you. Nan, you wanted to add to what you said?
Yeah, if I'm now just I want to address the question by somebody who asked Kun Mon. Yeah, I think the issue of sustainability is being addressed in several trade agreements. Certainly not only at the WTO, you know, in many FTAs and regional FTAs, this issue has been taken up. But most recently, I think you may have heard about the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, the IPEF. I was in Paris for the first meeting ever to represent Thailand there. And I can tell you that this is going to be the one of the place where issue of sustainability will be discussed in relations to trade. Indeed, maybe faster than other. But in the WTO, we have been engaging on environment, but not yet climate change per se. But we have many forums. We have the committee and also different plurilateral discussion on some of the issues. You know, the plastic and the we call it the TESD. So it's been going on. At the moment, we are not clear yet how to consolidate discussion in the WTO to form a broader climate change and trade discussion. But I hope that this year we at least to try to attempt to put everything on different track to have a greater picture, clearer and broader pictures on how to address and reconcile trade objective and sustainability. Yeah, so that's my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much to all of you. I do have one poll question for, let me see if I can launch it for everyone, including participants and the speakers, and that is related to writing a letter to Santa, and what will be your one single wish for Santa to bring to global trade next year. So one option is return of functioning of dispute settlement, implementation of fisheries subsidies, cease of trade tariff war between US, China, more RTAs, less RTAs, or nothing, it is good as it is. So let's see what we can have. I'll just leave it open for a couple of seconds more for people to engage, because we would really want to see. These are options that are very randomly selected, of course, and they are not very big tickets, some of them, but we just wanted to see the pulse of the room to see what we have. Right. So it seems that we still are very much focused on the polarization in the world, right? In terms of the big conflict between US and China that has been, as Rob rightly said, has not been somehow deflated, but actually have been risen to another level through the recent export bans for the semiconductors and parts and components, technology, etc. And so that will remain to be a worry for everyone, particularly the countries that are at the margins of that conflict. All right, so I will close the poll and share the results. So you have you see that major majority is really concerned with this polarity. Okay, I think we may have another question, and we have 1 minute. Oh, we are 1 minute over time. If I may keep you for maybe. Let me see, this is a specific question related to regional integration, and okay, it's more of a comment, so we don't we can't really answer that. Let me then try to in my thanking to Cecilia, Nan, and Robert for wonderful presentations on, you know, the good, bad, and ugly of trade, not only this year but prior to this, and looking into future. I think we have all agreed that we are relieved that we managed to get Geneva package through the ministerial conference successful completion, that while there were many gaps left, there are still sort of signs of countries wanting to work together in that forum and to maybe combine their very positive efforts that they have shown at the regional level, both Europe and Asia, maybe less so some others, but including, we didn't mention Africa, but including the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the countries working together from that end, that we can combine some positive sort of these results, however partial, with this positive energy and to move forward. So I think that is probably the biggest win of this year. And the other win, and I agree with all of you also that you said that realization that trade is actually a necessary part, a solution of you know, our path towards sustainable development and inclusive growth, and that without trade these goals cannot be achieved. Let me stop there on the good side. There are many other things that can be put out as well, but on the bad side, I think we all agree that the increase in use of trade restrictions in a discriminatory way is not acceptable, and that perhaps we should be asking more, not only from the WTO but also from members, in terms of self-discipline in not using those measures when other measures can do, and perhaps also look at where, you know, what we teach people to do, to realize where the problem is and what is the best policy to solve the problem, and often find that actually trade policy is not the best instrument in finding you know, solving the problem that is not trade related. So we should be using that approach as well in trying to sort of weaken this propensity of many governments to use trade policies left, right, and center whenever they have any problems, right? And I think also the problem is that this elephant, the lack of trust, but also more so the inclination of those that are in trade conflict to try to sort of strengthen their position by pulling other countries on their sides. And I think what Rob was saying in terms of resistance of countries that are open traders and that depend on actually being able to trade globally goes a long way to send a message to those trying to divide. I wouldn't say divide and rule, but it's close to that, right? And that trade needs to be an instrument of sustainable development. We used to call it engine of growth. We are now more politically correct and call it the instrument or tool of sustainable development. And I think that we find many evidence towards ability of trade to fulfill and improve people's livelihoods and improve their health, education, and you know, access to information, access to food, if you want to go to that extreme. So I'm not going to go further. I had many more questions that I might organize another session to go more deeply into these specific questions, related to regional trade agreements, the role of India in RCEP, or ability of RCEP to actually latch into these supply chains that are so dingling there as the alternative for reducing the dependence on China itself. Of course, TTC has completed or finished in between United States and European Union with some very significant outcomes and maybe some worrying outcomes. I hope that all of us working together and providing inspiration for those that design trade policies will help sort of reduce this conflicts in trade area. So before I close, I have to give you, each one of you, the last word. And so why don't I start with Rob now, and then go to Nan, and then to Cecilia. The last message to all of us before we close the seminar.
Oh, okay. Can I just say that perhaps highlight an issue that we haven't discussed, but which clearly must be discussed in any sort of wider discussion of the future of the trading system, and that is the whole issue of digital trade. And again, this is an area where we had high hopes in APEC for making progress on this issue. There has been some progress in the WTO in the e-commerce plurilateral, and even some text has been agreed, I believe, on some of the issues that perhaps were less controversial. So that's an area perhaps where conflict hasn't completely erupted and mutilated the landscape, if you like, but there may be some hope that we can reach some kind of progress on this really, really important area of international trade in the future.
Thank you, Rob. Nan?
I don't have any other final word except that we have seen that work trade is important. So I think if we try hard enough, we can make a difference. We in the trade policy circle. I hope that we will be able to get our acts together and really make a difference. That the world is going through very difficult phase. We've seen challenges in terms of pandemic, which may have come again in the future. Climate change is a long-term issue, but we need to start doing something now. Food is an immediate problem, need addressing and need political will to address it now. I personally don't think it will be a too long-term issue, but everything comes back to the conflict again. I hope that I don't want to sound cliche or very naive, but I hope for world peace.
Okay.
In
We
all
hear you.
respects. Yeah. So that's my final word. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you, Nan. And Cecilia, let us close with you.
No, I wanted to echo what has been said as well. If there's one thing we should hope for, is the return of the civilized conversation in all areas. I mean, there is so much we need to solve together, and you all mentioned it: the health issues, the climate issues, also the digitalization and the way that it will profoundly transform people's lives and trading patterns. And of course also the differences that we have. There's war, there are sanctions, there are profound differences, and they will not disappear, but at least to realize that we cannot solve them by increasing the level of conflict. We can only solve them by sitting together, preferably multilaterally, and discuss and come with common solution. And this is maybe a naive wish, but it's the only way that humankind, knows on how to make progress in these big issues. And if we have a perma crisis, maybe we can find a perma solution to at least some of them. So that's maybe naive, but profoundly felt wish for Christmas. And also thanking you, Mia, and Robert and Ambassador Nanda, that I was able to take part of this very interesting conversation. And to all of those who listened, of course.
Thank you very much. So we have not answered all the questions, and I'm extending you invitation for another round in New Year. Hopefully you will accept. And I wish you the peaceful holidays, health and good health, and very good New Year to all of you that joined us. And thank you very, very much in supporting ARTNeT. So all the best to all of you, and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Yeah, Happy Christmas to
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Yeah, Merry
Christmas.
Christmas. Merry
World
Christmas.
peace. Let's have world peace.
World peace.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.